Hey, this is a video for 8.2, Human Impacts on Ecosystems. So go ahead, squint your eyes and check out the overview and set up your guided notes. Now, recall that we have a range of tolerance, and instead of saying it's bad for the organism, bad for the environment, they can't survive, something like that, you say that the conditions are outside of that individual species range of tolerance. Now, some of them, we have the physiological stress, and then we have the zone of intolerance. And recall that we should never say that organisms are harmed. We say that they would have physiological stress. That is this area in the yellow, but this bell curve, you're going to have the highest population when the conditions are normal, like Goldilocks. At physiological stress, you're going to have limited growth. The reproduction is going to be greatly reduced if it's present at all. There might be difficult breathing or processing oxygen or undergoing respiration. Organisms may asphyxiate. There may be hormonal disruptions. Right now we're going to talk about coral reefs, and if you've ever had a chance to snorkel in a coral reef, if you're not freaked out by fish, I highly recommend it. Do it sustainably. This was done off the coast of Belize a couple of spring breaks ago. I went with Miss Greenaway, and it was fun. We got to see some stingrays. Those are manatees. That's a bald man in the ocean. We got to see sharks and lots of coral. Recall that coral is a symbiotic organism. There is the coral polyp, which is the animal. It's like a jellyfish. And then they have algae that live in their tissues. And the coral polyps extract or give off this calcium carbonate skeleton. So they're basically forming this exoskeleton on which they are living. So the coral, even though they don't look like they're alive, they are living organisms. The coral itself are providing a home. They're providing a place for the algae. They're providing, the algae are providing glucose for the coral, and the coral is providing the structure for the algae to live. Now, corals do not have a wide range of tolerance. They have a very narrow range of tolerance, very specific conditions, very specific temperature conditions, very specific pH conditions. And anytime that these conditions, or that when they get into physiological stress, the coral will expel the algae. And that is what's known as coral bleaching. And coral bleaching, if this is a normal coral reef, after it's been bleached, the coral will expel the algae, and those algae are what's giving the coral their color. So you could come by, in fact, there's an amazing movie called Chasing Coral. I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix if you have Netflix. But it basically talks about bleaching events in the Great Barrier Reef and in different reefs around the world. But when this happens, it's caused because we are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, which is causing the climate to change. Global temperatures are increasing, water temperatures are increasing. Also, with the added carbon dioxide, that is causing the ocean to be acidified. So that carbon dioxide is dissolving in the water and creating carbonic acid, thereby lowering the pH. This is causing too much stress to the coral, so they will expel the algae. Remember, they do have a narrow range of tolerance. So the coral are dead or end up dying because the algae are expelled. Now, there are ways of reversing the coral bleaching, but a lot of times when we see the bleaching, it's already too late. And that can lead to biodiversity loss because with the coral gone, it's an entire trophic cascade. So this ecosystem will go from being vibrant to being just barren like a desert. Other damages to coral reef environments include sediment pollution, and that can be from runoff, and that would impact the photosynthesis. Remember that sediment would block the sunlight from entering the water, and that can impact the amount of photosynthesis that is occurring in the algae. There's also destructive practices like fishing. If you're fishing, and especially if you're bottom trawling, remember that is dragging like a net or some sort of basket on the bottom of the ocean floor in the benthic region. When you're doing that, you are damaging all of the coral, and it takes a long time for those coral to recover. Recreation, like boating. Boating is adding chemicals from the exhaust. It's adding chemicals into the water. Other recreation, if you're swimming and you put on sunscreen, a lot of the sunscreen has those oxybenzones that's going to be damaging to the coral structure. Other impacts, we have oil spills. Oil spills are very damaging. There's two of them you should know. The Deepwater Horizon occurred in 2010. It happened in the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a huge fire that went for, a month and a half to 2 months, and it was the largest oil spill in history. Now, the biggest one that I remember growing up was the Exxon Valdez, and that was up in off of the coast of Alaska, up in the Pacific Northwest. And both of those had millions of gallons of oil spilled out into the ocean. Now, those of us that live in North Brooklyn, in fact, in the area of Greenpoint, there's actually slowly been a spill for the last 70 years. Like between 17 and 30 million gallons have spilled out in the underground in Greenpoint. There's a lot of incidents of cancer up here. We'll probably be talking about it in class, but it's contributed to the pollution in the Newtown Creek. But the oil spills, the hydrocarbons that are present, are toxic. Also, it can impact the fish breathing, fish undergoing respiration. It can affect their gills. It can affect the birds and not allow them to fly. That toxicity, it's because it's outside of the organism's range of tolerance. But this can cause the growth to be limited for fish or wildlife. It can impact fish and animal respiration. It can also reduce reproduction. And the worst would be asphyxiation. That's if, like, for example, a fish's gills would be coated, it wouldn't be able to breathe. Now, to clean up, there are physical methods. One method, obviously, is shoveling up the oil if it's on rocks, maybe rinsing off the rocks, collecting the rocks, cleaning them, and then returning them. If the oil is in the water, they can apply these floating booms, which are kind of like giant pool noodles that kind of like contain the oil, and then they can like scoop or suction the oil off of the top of the water. You can use a chemical cleanup. A plane can fly by and spray dispersants, and the idea for that is not necessarily to like get rid of the oil, but it's to allow the oil to like break up into smaller pieces and then kind of settle out into the ocean. So you're basically just like breaking it up, which is not the best. Another chemical way of cleaning up is using soap, and you've probably seen commercials for Dawn. They use soap to clean organisms. Soap is really good at getting out grease, and the oil is more soluble in the soap, so it can help to clean that up as well. You can also use biological methods. There are bacteria that do feed off of crude oil. So if you, it's probably a little bit more expensive, but it is also a way of eliminating some of this toxins in the ocean after an oil spill. Now, we also have solid waste pollution, and the oceans are hugely littered with especially a lot of plastics, whether it is large plastics like you see in this image, or if it is microplastics, like little tiny microplastics from like hair gels, or like cleansers have a lot of microbeads in them. Well, that can get into the organisms. And examples are plastic waste. You could have old tires, wrappers. I can't tell you how frustrating it is, not only to see people smoking outside, but when they open up their cigarette and just let that cellophane wrapper or any type of wrapper go onto the street, chances are that's going to go into the ocean. And when it goes into the ocean, it's not going to, if it already was clear, that's bad. If it wasn't clear, it's probably going to lose a lot of its coloring, and it's going to look transparent. And turtles And other organisms are going to think it's a jellyfish and they're going to snatch it right up and eat it. And then that is going to block their digestive tract and cause them to starve to death. So thank you, litter bugs, for killing the turtles. Now, some non-examples are organic waste, like a manure lagoon, for example, at a CAFO. Another example would be fertilizers from agricultural fields, toxic waste from manufacturing facilities, and radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. These are not considered solid waste pollution, mostly because they're not solid. Now, some impacts from solid waste, from plastics. Organisms can asphyxiate. It can, get into if they get a straw in their nose. I've seen that before. You've probably seen images of that. If it gets into the fish's gills, plastic from fishing lines or something like that can interfere with their breathing, can cause them to asphyxiate. Rings from soda cans, the 6-pack rings. If that gets around a turtle's neck or an organism's neck and they grow, it can stunt their growth and can cause them to die. It can also interfere with digestion. When all of this plastic goes into their stomach, it's not digestible and it basically takes the place of food. Medical waste, if we have any biohazardous waste, that's waste that comes from a human, it could contaminate other people. Needles could transmit disease. This is something that is also showing up a lot, especially with our opioid epidemics. We're seeing a lot of discarded needles going into the sewage system, but also just ending up on beaches. And coal ash. Coal ash is what's left over after generating electricity. Remember, most of our electricity comes from coal. So this coal ash will release mercury, and also it can release leachate from the landfills. So if the landfills are leaking, it can contaminate the groundwater. Now, sediment pollution. Sediment can come from a variety of places. It can come from construction. The dust that's generated on the construction site. It can come from monocropping. The soil is exposed, and anytime it would rain after the harvest, the dust particles, the soil particles, some of the clay could wash away into a body of water. From tilling, because you're breaking up the soil, you're loosening it up. That can also contribute to some of that soil washing away. And transportation. Because the highways are impervious surfaces, so any dust or any sediments that end up on the highway could wash away and end up in a body of water. Now, that is a problem because it could lead to fish death, because the gills could get clogged. It could cause a trophic cascade because it may impact the predator's vision. The predator is not able to see the prey. If the predators aren't able to keep the prey in check, the prey could consume all of the producers, for example, if they're herbivores. That could lead to a trophic cascade. We can reduce productivity because there's less sunlight entering the water, there's less photosynthesis, less primary productivity. And finally, can lead to eutrophication because some of that sediment might have nutrients in it, and that can lead to an algal bloom. Eutrophication, growth of algae, and then you have hypoxia once that algae dies. Now, all of this put together is biodiversity loss. So, talking now about dissolved oxygen, which is the concentration of oxygen molecules in a body of water. These are relative amounts, these you don't have to know the amounts, but the dissolved oxygen is relatively stable. And remember that warm water holds less oxygen, cold water holds more oxygen. That's because gases are more soluble at cooler temperatures. Now we have dissolved oxygen and we have the biological oxygen demand. Now this is really the reason we would need a lot of oxygen is if we have a lot of consumers, if we have a lot of bacteria in the water. So the more bacteria you have, the more oxygen demand you have. The more organic material you have, the higher the oxygen demand. So these two are going to be color-coded for this demonstration. But let's just say you have some organic waste that is dropped into, like you have sewage plant leaks. You have, any sort of effluent from any facility that is, or runoff from a fertilizer or from a field. That could be any sort of organic waste. And then you're going to see a spike in the biological oxygen demand. That's because this has a lot of organic material. That means the bacteria will need to break that down. And in order for the bacteria to break it down, they require oxygen. So then over time, the bacteria are going to break this down, and then the bacteria are going to dissipate, and this oxygen level will recover. Now, the dissolved oxygen level is going to look like this. It's not going to fall right away because the bacteria are going to slowly consume all the oxygen. So the dissolved oxygen is going to decrease, and then it's going to gradually recover as these bacteria consume all the waste and eventually die. Now, this area right here, when the oxygen level goes down, is called an oxygen sag curve because it's sagging down. Now, if we graph this, the dissolved oxygen and the distance with the organic content. So as we increase distance, the dissolved oxygen will increase. That's the red. As we increase distance, now this is from the point of spillage, for example. As we increase the distance, the organic content will decrease. And that organic content is directly linked to the biological oxygen demand. Now this area, when our dissolved oxygen is less than the oxygen demand, this is considered hypoxia. And that is exactly why it has this prefix. Hypo means under. A hypodermic needle goes under your skin. Think about hyper, like hyperactive. It's over, like overactive. So hypo means under. The dissolved oxygen is less than the biological oxygen demand. Now we have some areas, a lot of our coastal areas in the United States, especially the East Coast, this is where we have hypoxia. All of these red dots are areas where hypoxia is occurring. A lot of areas that are industrial, a lot of industrial waste. A lot of the Gulf of Mexico has low oxygen content because it's kind of like, it looks like a bay, and there's not a lot of circulation, at least not as much as you would find in the open ocean. Also, Northern Europe is very, very hypoxic in the waterways and the oceans up there, or the seas. And these areas that are blue are where the oxygen levels are extremely low. So we have some dead zones in our area. We have one that you'll probably hear about is Chesapeake Bay in the DC area, but Jamaica Bay and the South Jersey, there are dead zones as well in the ocean. And how do we know this? Well, we can do a couple of different tests. We can test for water quality, but one of the easier ways is just looking for macroinvertebrates. And macroinvertebrates are organisms without backbones that can indicate how toxic an ecosystem is. Now, if we have some organisms like these snails with a wide range of tolerance, they are going to be pollution tolerant. If we see a lot of these, it might indicate that this waterway or this area of or water sample is polluted. If we see high populations of another organism that is pollution sensitive with a narrow range of tolerance, this could indicate a better water quality. So basically, the range of tolerance is directly related to the amount of pollution in a waterway, along with the population of those related indicator species. We're going to be doing an activity in class that kind of indicates this, so you'll kind of get to practice with this. But what I would like you to practice now is this check for understanding. And then finally, I want you to explain how macroinvertebrates can be used as an indicator of water quality. I hope that this video was informative. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you soon.